Let's start. So my topic today is really cap and trade systems, or how they compare to taxes and trading. So cap and trade systems, as you may know, are widely used to address climate change. They're the most widely used tool in the world right now. There are currently about 68 different cap and trade systems around the world designed to address climate change. And it is really the central tool used to address one of the most, maybe the most important problem facing the world today. And so what I want to talk about is, why that tool, how do we compare it to other tools, what are the problems, how does it work, and if it's so great, where else might we use it? In particular, I want to compare cap and trade systems to torts, to taxes, and to regulation. Chicago Best Ideas is supposed to be about ideas coming out of the University of Chicago. Cap and trade systems have their origin with North Coast, this idea of property rights, and so the connection to Chicago is obviously coast, but we know a lot more about cap and trade systems now than he ever could have, and so we'll talk a lot more about what we know now that was not so evident then. By the way, just interrupt me as we go. I'm not comfortable unless people are interrupting, so please stop and ask questions where I feel like something's wrong. All right, so let me just talk about how cap and trade systems work using a really simple example. Suppose there's just two polluters out there. And they're each currently emitting 75 units of pollution, whatever that is. It could be tons of CO2 or gigatons of CO2, whatever it is currently. But they're different from each other. For one of them, it's really expensive to reduce pollution, and for one of them, it's really cheap. Right? So one has a high cost and one has a low cost. And the government gets together and says, this pollution is really bad, and we want to reduce the amount of pollution. It decides that we want to reduce pollution to 100 units. Right? Now, what it could do is it could say to polluter 1 and polluter 2, this is how many units you each should produce. Right? And it would have to do that. It would have to know kind of what the cost structure is of these two different polluters, and therefore decide how much one gets. Suppose instead it just says, look, all we know is we think the right amount of pollution is 100. And so here's what we'll do. We'll give each of you, let's say to be fair, we'll give each of you 50 units. And we'll just kind of divide it equally. It doesn't have to be that. I could divide it anywhere if it wants, but just say it divides it equally, 50 units each. And then you guys figure out who's going to pollute. All right, and the way you can do that is you each have 50 units, the right to emit 50 units of pollution. And if, say, polluter 1 wants to pollute more than polluter 2, it can buy a unit from polluter 2. Right? So the right to pollute 50 units is tradable. What's going to happen if that system occurs? Well, polluter 1 has a high cost of reducing pollution. Polluter 2 has a low cost. So what's polluter 1 going to do? It's going to say, well, look, if I have to go down to 50, it's really expensive. And if 2 has to go down to 50, it's really cheap. Right? So polluter 1 is going to say to 2, can I buy some permits from you? Right? Because it's easier, let's say polluter 1 goes only down to 51, and polluter 2 goes down to 49, right? They save money. Right? Because it's cheaper for polluter 2 to reduce emissions. The total amount stays the same, still 100, but who gets to pollute changes and overall costs go down. Right? How long will they keep on trading? They'll keep on trading. Polluter 1 will keep on trading, buying pollution permits from polluter 2 until there's no gains from trade. When will that occur? When the cost of the reducing emissions for each polluter is the same. Right? And so you have some allocation. Maybe that polluter 1 actually ends up keeping his pollution at 75 and polluter 2 goes down to 25. There'll be some allocation that minimizes the cost of reducing pollution, and yet you still get the same overall pollution, but you save costs. That's the idea. It's become wildly popular in environmental regulation. In the language of torts, what's going on here is the government has to determine the total amount of pollution, but it doesn't have to determine the cost of care for each individual polluter. It has to just determine the aggregate in the economy. Now each polluter, knowing its own internal cost structure, can then trade in the market with each other. If there's more than 2, if there's dozens or hundreds, trade in the market knowing its own internal cost structure to determine how much to pollute, right? So it's informationally efficient in the sense the government only has to do the overall amount, It doesn't have to know what the cost structure is of each individual polluter. That's known to each polluter, and they can take advantage of that by trading in the market. That's the basic idea. It's become widely popular, as I just said. So here's some examples of what I call traditional cap and trade systems. These are cap and trade systems where the government sets a total quantity limitation, like the example I just gave, allocates permits one way or another to polluters in the market who then trade. One of the most famous systems was the SO2 system for acid rain in the United States. And one reason why cap and trade systems became so popular was this was viewed as an enormous success, right? It reduced the cost of, lowered the cost of reducing emissions from SO2, of reducing acid rain dramatically, much more than expected, and allow the government to reduce the total amount of acid rain more than it otherwise thought it was going to do. Right, there's a bunch of other ones, so ozone, so PM 2.5 and ozone, famous, and there's climate change examples as well. So the European Union has a climate change system, as does California. Just some other examples. These are examples of what I call performance trading. So here's the idea. Think about, the example I gave was your government sets a total quantity of pollution, knows how much it wants out there or should be allowed out there, and then people trade. But once you think about trading, you realize you can trade against anything. So take the CAFE standards. They're on the list there at the top. Those are the standards for gas mileage for your cars, right? Miles per gallon. The government sets a target miles per gallon, and automobile manufacturers have to meet it. What happens if you're a manufacturer that specializes in big trucks, SUVs or pickup trucks, and you have trouble meeting the cap, the target? The way the CAFE standards are designed is you can buy mileage per gallon units from another manufacturer. So if Ford is above the mileage per gallon target and GM is below it, that makes really, let's say, really small cars or efficient cars, it can sell the excess miles per gallon of its fleet to Ford, right? So it's not selling a quantity, it's selling compliance with the regulation, right? And if it over-complies with the regulation, it gets credit so it can sell to someone who under-complies. Essentially, then you can, once you think about that, you can trade anything, not just amounts of pollution, but anything in the world, right? So if you set a regulatory standard, anyone over-complies can sell to anyone who under-complies. And what happens is overall compliance remains the same. You have the overall set of cars in the United States still have the same overall miles per gallon. It's just that some manufacturers exceed it, some are below it, but we've met our overall target. And once you do that, once you realize that, you can see many, many other examples of this kind of trading where it's not against a quantity, but it's against some arbitrary regulatory standard, right? So the Clean Power Plan, Obama's failed and repealed climate change plan had a system like this where they're going to trade against emissions intensity of power plants, right? The zero emissions vehicle credit, the next one there, which is in California, is how Tesla got founded, right? What happened was it was a zero emissions car, and California had a standard for zero emissions fleets, and since Tesla exceeded that standard, it was actually zero emissions, they could get credits and they could sell to other manufacturers who were making gasoline cars. And that's how it funded its initial operations, was through this performance trading. You can trade against energy efficiency, renewable fuel, anything you want. It goes beyond that. You can trade environmental services. So there are several places in the world now, in the United States, Australia primarily, that allow you to trade water quality. Right, so there are environmental standards for clean water, or for salinity, or water temperature, and you can trade it. So if your water temperature exceeds the standards set, so it's cooler, not hotter than it's supposed to be, or whatever it is, then you can trade your excess temperature to someone else whose water exceeds it, right, or water quality. You can trade endangered species. So there's biodiversity trading, right, or you can trade wetlands. So you're not allowed to destroy wetlands when you build under the Clean Water Act. And the Army Corps of Engineers, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, allows you to buy and sell wetlands in order to efficiently allocate wetlands and build them. Right? So there's kind of what I can think of either exotic or environmental services trading, where you can trade anything that's providing some environmental benefit, wetlands or fish species or biodiversity, anything like that you can trade and generate lower costs of preserving that benefit and have the government set the overall target for that benefit. Right, so it's enormously popular. There are literally hundreds of these trading systems. When I originally started writing on this, my idea was I'd seen the CAFE standards here, and I thought, oh, this is great. There'd be lots of places we can think of where there should be trading, and there isn't. Once we realized you can trade against anything. And I started looking at everywhere I looked in environmental law, there already was trading. Essentially, the area is completed. It has taken over environmental law in the sense that almost anything you can think of, not quite, but almost everything you can think of now has trading. The question is, why? Why is it so popular? And second question, if it's so popular in environmental law, why don't we see it everywhere? Right? Why don't we see it everywhere? So, I don't know if you commute on Lakeshore Drive, you're not supposed to speed. Why can't you speed and buy credits for someone who wants to drive more slowly and get speeding credits? Right? Why not trade everything? Right? We don't allow that. Right? And the question is, what are the problems with trading that limits it, and why is it so popular in environmental law? So what I want to do to examine that is to compare it to torts, taxes, and regulation. But you're supposed to be interrupting me, so yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Is there a concern that a firm might monopolize credits?
I'm sorry, I've not proved that.
Is there a concern that a firm is trying to monopolize credits? Say Tesla, for example, buys a bunch of CAFE credits and then doesn't sell them, so all the other firms are stuck, essentially.
Well, no, but the reason why generally is, well, maybe yes, maybe no. In a thick market, CAFE is not a good example. It's not a very thick market, but in a thick market where there's lots of trading like SO2, so long as there's a lot of participants and the initial credit allocation is broad-based, so don't give all the credits to you, then it'd be very hard for someone to monopolize it, right? They'd have to spend a lot of money buying it up, and it really wouldn't be worth it. The CAFE standards are actually not great trading systems because it's really thin market, and you're only allowed to buy and sell amongst large manufacturers. So I can't go buy a CAFE standard. Whereas I can go buy an SO2 credit and burn it. I had a friend who used to give them to his kids for Christmas. Seriously, it's like, he was an environmentalist, and he was like, Christmas, because it was a better environment by buying these credits and burning them, throwing them in the garbage. We have a system in here at University of Chicago where you can buy CO2 credits from California, and we put them in a vault. It's called Climate Vault, climatevault.org, and we literally do the same thing. You can buy CO2 credits and put them in a vault. But so long as the market's pretty thick, it shouldn't be a problem. If the market's really thin and one person has the dominant number of credits, it might be a problem. But if I were really, really rich, I could buy all these credits and express my preferences for lower pollution by doing that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like one of the critiques of the cap and trade environmental regulation is like the distributional concern that like you might be, the overall level might be where you want it to be, but like you have pollution concentrated in high areas.
Yeah. So I want to get to that. I'm going to call that hotspots and talk about that as one of the major problems with cap and trade systems, and one reason why we don't see them in lots of other places. So if I don't answer your question by the end of the hour, raise your hand again. All right.
So I have a question about innovation. So it seems like the Tesla story makes it sound like Tesla was able to innovate because they're able to fund themselves based on the cap and trade. But I also sort of remember reading at some point that California setting their standards for miles per gallon limits, basically because they're such a large state market, basically define the rest of the U.S. And so everyone raised their standards, which probably create a lot of change. So I guess my question is, do you know of any studies or is there any work being done to measure if innovation is actually better off in cap and trade or by just setting higher floors? Like if you create a higher floor, it might be politically harder to get through, but I can see how you could just have all these people then trying to innovate to get out of it if they're scared more regulations on it.
Well, I want to compare, so it depends on what tool you're comparing it to, what your options are. But the basic idea of cap and trade and most of these tools as well, is that you should have incentives to innovate because there you are, you're polluting, you're emitting CO2 or SO2 or whatever you're polluting, and you can save money by putting in a new machine, a new technology, and selling the credits, right? Whereas if it's just a regulation, then you don't really save money in some sense, right? Because by over-exceeding this regulation only do this much. If you exceed that, you don't get any benefit from it, right? So the idea of either a tax or we'll talk about tort or cap and trade is it generates innovation incentives because it really creates this market, right? And you can benefit from the market trade. Whereas regulation may not have that, although it depends on how you design the regulation. In terms of the overall level the government sets, the theory would be, we've got to compare these, we haven't done that yet. If cap and trade turns out to be the cheapest system for reducing pollution, again, we've got to compare this, we don't know that, it may not be, then it should allow the government to set a lower standard of pollution because it imposes fewer costs on industry. Right, so if what keeps government from saying zero pollution is the cost of reducing pollution, picking the lowest cost system should allow the government to set the lowest pollution level, right? Because it reduces the cost on pollution. Yeah.
So what happens in your framework with new entrants? So we want to keep the level at 100, and so if we have new entrants to the market, they'll reduce the price for other players, and is that good or bad?
So it depends on the system. So for something like these guys, performance trading, there's no problem with new entrants, right? What they do for these guys for fixed amounts is a new entrant basically has to buy permits from someone else. So they'll come in and usually get zero. But typically, like the EU ETS, EU ETS is up there. Is they'll do it's like a 3-year system, and so it keeps on renewing every 3 years or 5 years, whatever it is, and so they kind of have a new allocation of permits. The permits are not true property rights in the sense that we have land you own in perpetuity. They're the right to pollute for a fixed number of years, like 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, and then they expire. You might be able to carry them over the next period or not, depending on the system. But then 3 years from now, there's a new system, a new allocation. And that can be done either by just freely handing out the permits or by having an auction. And if you enter in the intervening period, you're gonna have to buy permits. Because
it might, store them, either option seems like store the market structure, right? I think in terms of promoting the market if you enter.
yeah, a tax is gonna be a little better on that because the tax you can always enter for free and you just pay the tax. Right. One of the issues with cap and trade, the tax is not gonna have is market design. Right, market design turns out to be really hard. All right. So to compare these guys, we want to have a common set of facts. So I'll just do like a really simple made-up hypothetical, which is someone engages in some harm-causing activity. And this could be anything, not just pollution. It could be take any case from torts class, any wild fact pattern. Someone's engaging in some activity that hurts somebody else. Right? That's the key. Right? The canonical case would be pollution, but it doesn't have to be that. Driving, blasting, going near other people in a pandemic, you name it, we can think about it. Destroying valuable resources hurts other people because they might have wanted those resources. So wetlands, for example, provide environmental services. They filter water. They clean water. It's really important to have wetlands, and if you destroy wetlands, you hurt people who want to have access to those services. Right, so any fact pattern where someone's engaging in activity that harms someone else. And what we want to do is think about how best to regulate that activity. Right, because without any regulation, without anything at all, then people will not consider fully the people they're harming, and therefore engage in too much of the activity. So just anything like that. All right. Taxes. Okay, what do I mean by a tax? I don't mean an income tax or a property tax or a consumption tax. I mean a very specific kind of tax. It's known as a Pigouvian tax after the economist Arthur C. Pigou. And his idea was that if you impose a tax on someone who's causing harm, say a polluter, equal to the harm that they cause for each unit of pollution. then they'll take that harm into account when deciding how much to pollute, how to behave, and therefore make the socially correct decision. If they're making it without the tax, they make a decision that's correct for them. They consider all their own costs and benefits, but not the decision that's correct for society because there's external costs and benefits. But so long as the tax causes them to pay all those external costs and benefits, then they consider everything society wants them to consider, and they make the overall socially correct decision. Right? That's the basic idea. This should sound familiar to you in the following sense. It should sound familiar to you because it's the same, or almost the same as strict liability. Right? With strict liability, if you engage in a harm-causing activity, and then you actually harm someone and they sue you, you pay their harm, right? Damages, right? Tax, you engage in a harm-causing activity, you pay a tax to the government, not to the victim, but you pay an amount of money equal to the expected harm, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're negligent or not, anything like that, you pay regardless, right? Pavlovian taxes and strict liability are kind of the same thing. Right, in terms of the incentives they impose on actors, right? They both cause the actors to fully internalize the harm that they're causing to somebody else. Right, so the first comparison we can make then is, well, what are the differences between taxes and strict liability torts? Why would we ever use one versus the other? One key difference, of course, is with a tax, you pay when you pollute. When you engage in a harm-causing activity, right? So if emitting CO2, we're emitting CO2 right now because we have the lights on and the heat in the room, we would be paying a tax right now, even though the people that are going to be harmed might be alive 100 years from now, right? They haven't sued us yet, or they're a tort, but we pay the tax now, right? With a tort, you don't pay any fee up front, you wait till someone sues you, and then you got to pay them when they sue you. So taxes are kind of ex ante, and torts are ex post, and there's advantages and disadvantages of each. Right? What's the advantage of ex post, of using torts? Well, if you wait until there's actually harm, then it's easier to measure what the harm is. Right? Someone's in front of you and they're injured. You know, they say, I'm hurt by this. You know the harm's actually occurred, and you can measure the harm, and therefore it being ex post provides an informational advantage. Right? Whereas ex ante, what are you going to do? You got to run some model or something like that and try to figure out what is going to be the harm from this activity, even though it hasn't occurred yet. Right? So tax, you need some estimation of the harm, to be able to expected harm is, whereas torts, you don't. Of course, with torts, for torts to work, the polluter has to be able to calculate expected harm. Right, so there you are, you're polluting, we're polluting right now. If someone were going to sue us for the harm we're causing by this pollution we're engaging in right now, and we're going to take that lawsuit into account in our behavior, but we have to estimate the expected harm. Right, if we didn't do that, then we couldn't take it into account. So the way to think about the ex ante ex post is who has to estimate the expected harm. Right, in both cases you have to predict it, but with torts, it's the polluter that does. With tax, it's the government. Right? It's different parties, and they have different information. It might be the case the government's better at it. It might be the case that polluters are better at it. They're also institutionally different. Right? Torts, you got lawyers and courts, discovery, and all that jazz. It's really expensive. With tax, you have a bureaucracy. Right? You have people like me, tax lawyers, who do this, and there's again benefits and costs to that, right? You have there's benefits of having professional bureaucracy. They know the subject matter. They can think about this very carefully. They have expertise basically. You don't have to count on juries and judges who may not know what they're doing, and so institutionally they look really quite different. Also with torts, you require the victim to come forward to sue. Right? So institutionally, the system is victims harmed, they decide not to lump it. They decide to go ahead and sue, and then they sue. Right? So you're relying on the victim to come forward, and relying on their lawyers and courts to figure out what the answer is. With tax, you don't need the victim in a second. You just have this bureaucracy, you do it ex ante, and you're relying on professional expertise.
For torts, how would you define like standing for like a really sort of broad-based amount of harm?
Yeah, so one of the differences, once you say I'm using a court system, you bought into that, you buy into all of these doctrines that come with courts, right? So you buy, I was thinking about this last night as I was writing my notes out, you buy into standing doctrine when you get torts. It comes as a package, right? And what's interesting though, you say, well, you need standing. You can't impose liability without standing. But of course, you can do exactly the same thing economically without standing by doing a tax, which kind of makes fun of standing doctrine, right? Because like, well, why do we have standing doctrine if I can do the same thing without it? And what if I prefer the tort system? You know, ex post is better. Why do I have to buy that whole package that comes with it, rather than being able to pick and choose and say, well, I can do tax without standing, but I like these features of tort, so why do I have to get standing? Why do I have to get standing with it? So yeah, it's a problem that you buy this institution, and they're kind of lumpy. You buy the whole thing, right? And so institutionally they're different, right? And actually standing, again, the Supreme Court's revisiting and destroying or changing whatever it is standing doctrine as we speak. I gather it's not my area of expertise yet.
Do administrative law courts have to abide by standing rules, or can they come up with their own procedure?
Administrative courts or ALJs? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Like under like the Clean Air Act or something like that.
Yeah, like can you get the torts kind of procedure in administrative law courts and then ignore the standing doctrine?
I don't think so. But like the Clean Air Act will create, citizen suits or something. They can create the ability for people to sue.
Well, the question is whether the Supreme Court's going to allow that or not, but yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think in ALJs you can just come and be someone like generally qualified.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things is Congress can't necessarily just say no standing doctrine. Maybe they can, maybe they're not, but they might have some limits on how much they can just create standing. And so the Supreme Court may say this package comes as a whole. You can't pick and choose, and you might say, well, why are they doing that? I don't know. The other big difference between torts and tax is victim compensation, right? Torts tends to have victim compensation built in. That's there for two reasons. One, you might think that's a good idea, and number two, you need it to get people to come forward to sue in the first place, right? Taxes don't have victim compensation built in because you pay the tax to the government. Now, you can do victim compensation with the tax, but it's just a separate bureaucracy. Right? The government's got the money, it can do whatever it wants with the money, including compensating victims. But that would be just an add-on system, not necessarily something that's built into the tax. All right. Taxes versus cap and trade. When you think about the cap and trade system as property systems, right? They set a quantity. They give you this right to do something, to put pollution in the air, right? So you think of a cap and trade system as you have a property right to that amount of air, let's say, to pollute. And of course, taxes are our tax systems. The question is, how does property rights type system and a tax system vary? A property rights system is a quantity system, right? Just here's how much pollution we're going to have. And a tax system is a price system. Here's the price on the amount of pollution. Now, fundamentally, property systems and price systems, quantity systems and price systems are the same. And this is a supply and demand diagram. You've seen them before. In Chicago, you give a talk, you have to have one. If you don't, they yank me in a hook, they pull you out. On the x-axis is pollution. So it's a little funny x-axis. Usually the x-axis in the supply and demand diagram is a good. In this case, it's a bad. It's pollution. I could have drawn it with pollution reduction, but it's kind of confusing that way. So it's pollution, and Q is the quantity, amount of pollution. And on the y-axis is always with supply and demand, it's a price. And we have downward sloping pollution's marginal cost. So why is that downward sloping? It should be upward sloping. No, the more pollution you get, the lower the cost. So it should be downward sloping, right? So if you have very, very low pollution, the marginal cost will be really high. And a lot of pollution, you move to the right, the marginal cost should be low. And if a lot of pollution, though, the victim is going to be harmed a lot. So the kind of upward, the red curve is upward sloping. Okay? Now, if we set the marginal harm of the victim equal to the marginal cost of reducing pollution, we would set a quantity of Q. Right? We would say the total amount is 100 in my example, pollution would be 100. And if there were trading in permits, we set Q permits out there, and they were trading, what price would they trade at? At P. We could exactly equivalently set a tax of P, and polluters, knowing they got to pay price P, would, how much would they pollute? Q. Right, so we can exactly equivalently set a tax of P or a quantity of Q and expect the same results. Right, that is fundamentally property systems and price systems are the same. Now, Ronald Coase, of course, was writing, you know, the Coase theorem, you may not know the full background of it. The Coase theorem was designed, was about this issue. Property systems versus price systems. What he was arguing was that Pagoo was wrong. Pagoo said we can have a tax of P there and we'll get the efficient result. And what the Coase theorem was really about was saying you don't need no darn tax because if property rights are fully specified, there'll be no externalities, right? That's the Coase theorem. And so if we just set a quantity of Q, you don't need a tax. Was the Coase theorem. But of course, if you have a price of P, you don't need the property system, right? It works in reverse too. Pagoo was also right. You don't need Coase if you got Pagoo. You don't need Pagoo if you got Coase. You got to figure out which one's better, right? And Coase didn't really help us with that, deciding which one's better. We know they're fundamentally equivalent in some basic sense, but they're substitutes for one another. And Pagoo versus Coase or Coase versus Pagoo, we need to go a lot deeper than that. Right. Now, there's a really large literature on the differences between property systems and price systems, and also some papers on this. Let me just give you three differences. I think it's my next slide. The first one is what's known as error costs. Right. So when we set, I'm going to go back a slide. When we set Q or P, depending on which one we do, we're going to be wrong. We're just human. We're not going to get this right. We're going to misestimate the slopes of these curves or the heights of these curves because we have imperfect information. We're mere humans, and so we're going to be wrong. And the question is, which one is worse when we're wrong? We want to pick the one that is least bad when we're inevitably wrong. Okay? That's the idea. Now, they differ in the consequences of being wrong. Think about setting a tax, a price. The government sets the price, but quantity can vary. Right? The market determines how much to pollute for any given price. So if you can think about the tax system as having a fixed price, but flexibility on quantity. If the government does a cap and trade system, it fixes the quantity, but the market will determine the price of the permits, right? So you can think about a quantity system, permit system, as having a fixed quantity, but flexibility on price. And the question is, would you rather have price flexibility or quantity flexibility? Right, so think about, there you are, you're in Texas in the storm from 2 years ago. And electricity is really scarce. You need more electricity because it's really, really cold in Texas at that point in time. If you have a fixed quantity of pollution, you can't ramp up production of new pollution, of new electricity. The price is going to go really, really high. If the price goes really high, some people are going to suffer because they can't pay that price. They're going to be cold and freeze and so forth. Price flexibility might be really bad in that case because the consequences of a very high price might be bad. You might instead prefer quantity flexibility, so in an emergency, you can increase the quantity of pollution in that short period of time to handle the emergency. Okay? What about quantity flexibility? It might be really bad. Suppose the pollution is deadly. It's really bad. You don't want more of it. Then if there's an emergency, you don't want to increase the quantity because people will suffer from bad pollution effects. the way we think about this is which is steeper, the marginal cost curve or the marginal harm curve. And that'll determine which one you'd rather have flexibility on. So when you know when something's going to happen, when the quantity or the price is wrong, because some unanticipated future event, you're going to want to have some flexibility. The question is where you want to have that, and the systems are going to vary. We can't say anything in general because it's going to depend on the markets, but you might say it depends on whether the marginal cost curve is steeper than the marginal harm curve. There are institutional differences. We're just talking about this. Trading systems need whole mechanisms for trading. You need markets, you have derivatives and futures contracts and things, allocations and so forth, so the institutions look different. They're both government-run systems, right? You have government sets up the cap and trade system, government sets up the tax system, not like a court with with torts, but their institutions look quite different, right? Cap and trade, you've got traders out there, taxes you don't, and there's some advantages of each. Right? Some people say it's really good to have a market system, even though it's expensive to set up the market, because then people like Goldman Sachs and hedge funds can make money from this. And what's the advantage of that? Not that they make money, but that they lobby to have these systems put in place in the first place. Right? That is, you bring in someone other than environmentalists to say, yeah, let's stop pollution. Why? Goldman Sachs wants to do that because it can make money. Right? And that's good. It creates incentives for them to lobby for these pollution control systems, and therefore that's good. Or maybe that's bad because it's really expensive and you don't want them to make money. They're also framed differently, right? In the United States right now, calling something a tax is kind of deadly. Other countries, maybe it's really good. It depends on the particular political institutions, but they're framed differently. One of the things you can see when you call something a tax, call something a cap and trade system, if you go out there and look at proposals, is they're actually designed differently. People don't fully internalize the equivalence of these systems, and therefore when they propose designs for carbon taxes, they propose designs for carbon cap and trade systems, they propose different things. And you say, well why is that? You guys understand this, it's the same, and people don't quite get that. And so the systems that they propose are different just because of that framing, for better or worse. It's really hard to get around that. Okay. Final tool is regulation. So what's regulation? It means a lot of different things, but at the core of it, it means we just tell people what to do. You pollute this much, you pollute that much, you pollute that much, and so forth. We just tell people. You can even say, you use this technology, you use that technology, down to the, to the screw and the bolt and the, everything. If you look at regulation for step ladders, it determines, the depth of the steps and the height of the steps and the angle of the ladder and whether you go up and down in particular ways and how many hands you have to use when you go up and down. Every single movement on a step ladder and every single piece of metal on the ladder is regulated, right? So you can just basically tell people what to do. And that works great. You'd say, you can control pollution, control harm-causing activity just by saying, don't do it. That's the regulation. What's the difference between a regulation and these other tools? Well, the key difference, and the reason why a lot of economists don't like regulation, not because they don't want to internalize externalities, it's because they're informationally intensive. In order to tell people what to do, you, the government, have to know what it is people should do. Right, these other three systems, torts, cap and trade systems, and taxes, let people themselves determine what to do, and they just kind of impose these costs on people that cause them to internalize the harm, and then they decide. Regulation, the government has to decide, so it's informationally intensive. My next slide, right? Yeah. On the other hand, regulations may save information costs. How might they save information costs? Suppose we say, look, it's really hard to measure pollution. We might not have the technology to measure the amount coming out of a tailpipe or a smokestack or something like that, or that might be expensive. But it might be really easy to determine whether a power plant has put in a machine that limits pollution, like a scrubber, or a car, to determine whether a car has a catalytic converter. Right? That is, if you tell people what to do, then you have to just observe whether they did that or not. You don't actually have to observe the pollution. If you tell people how much to pollute, which is a cap and trade system or a tax even with a tort, you have to observe the pollution. And it might be easier to observe the machine, what you tell people to do, than to observe the resulting activity, the pollution. So although designing the regulation is information intensive, enforcing the regulation looks at different information than enforcing cap and trade and taxes, and therefore might be cheaper. Again, it's going to depend on the system. There's also institutional differences in all these cases. One example of institutional differences, obviously regulations come out of agencies. In the federal government, we require agencies to do cost benefit. And then it's reviewed by OMB, determine whether that's met or not. And courts then enforce cost benefit requirements on regulations. We don't do that for cap and trade and tax. We don't require cost benefit analysis. And maybe we should, when we're setting the tax rate, we should do all that same analysis. But institutionally, cost benefit analysis is required for regulations, enforced by OMB and by courts and the president's office and so forth. It's not the same thing is not required for cap and trade systems and taxes. Right? It's kind of like the standing issue. You get this package of stuff that comes with a regulation that's different than the package of things that comes with taxes and torts and cap and trade systems. And so institutionally, they look really different. Then enforcement differences look different as well. So taxes come with tax enforcement mechanisms, cap and trade systems, with whatever that comes there. With regulations, you've got administrative law judges and all this other stuff. And so the enforcement looks different as well. The fines may be different for violation and so forth. So the four systems, they're all different. They have costs and benefits of each one. We can't say in general we prefer one over the other. But it might be very much the case that in certain circumstances, like environmental pollution, that one or the other, like cap and trade, kind of dominates over other systems. Right? We don't use cap and trade for driving. It may not work very well, but we do for environmental law. And so it might be when you think about these differences across these systems, you can kind of explain some of the world. Lots of questions there. Yeah.
All these policies are usually done sort of at the national level, whereas at least some of these problems seem international, or that you could kind of trade away, that if you sort of cap pollution in the US, maybe more manufacturing just sort of moves to a different country and then is imported in. Is there any sort of difference across like these four different policy measures in terms of what maybe is more easily kind of traded away to another country versus what's sort of internalizing globally?
Yeah, so this is a complicated question. I think taxes and probably cap and trade are the ones that are going to be best suited to dealing with what's called the leakage problem. The leakage problem is if we impose a domestic carbon tax that our industry is fully offshore. And there are some solutions to the leakage problem that take advantage of the structure of taxes and where you impose them in the market. I'm being a little vague here. We can go into more detail maybe after. And you can do the same thing with cap and trade that I don't think you can do with regulation or with tort. Tort's particularly restricted because it's kind of this court-imposed thing, so it's hard to design it, if you will, because courts are doing it. The key idea with taxes on this issue, it's kind of a complicated issue, is that taxes alter the after-tax price of some good, like for climate change, it'll be primarily energy or fossil fuel energy. And so if you impose a domestic carbon tax on emissions from fossil fuels, you lower the price of energy because we use less of it. And so in foreign countries, you see a lower price of energy, and therefore there's an incentive to emit more abroad, either by our industry fleeing or industries growing abroad, right? And if you instead impose a tax on the extraction of fossil fuel rather than on the use of fossil fuel, then you raise the price abroad because you lower total extraction, the price goes up abroad. And what I've got this other paper you can show is if you design a tax that cleverly combines extraction taxes and demand side taxes, you can control what goes on abroad by controlling that, by controlling that price. You have to be really clever about it, but you can do that with taxes. It's hard to see how you do that with a regulation or with a tort. Right, so that's kind of a long answer. I can go into more detail afterwards, but I think probably taxes are a little better in that context. But a lot of these pollutants are not. So a lot of these things on those lists I had are just domestic stuff. All right, we have 15 minutes left. I want to talk about problems with cap and go a little more detail. Problems with cap and trade systems. There's one of the problems with them, and when do they fail? And I have this mnemonic I call them 5 M's, so that was maybe a little silly. Which is, for a cap and trade system to work, they need to have uniform mixing. This is the hotspot problem. You need to be able to measure the pollution. You got to deal with what I call morals or market failures. You need a lot of market. You need market depth or liquidity, and there needs to be some benefit from doing it. And the benefit arises when you have unobservable differences in marginal costs of polluters. Right. Without those things, you're not going to want to do cap and trade. Let me talk about them kind of briefly. All right. This is the mixing problem on hotspots. So go back to the initial example, polluter 1 and polluter 2, and the government set the total amount of pollution at 100. And it said, I don't really care who amongst you pollutes, so long as the total's the same. That statement has to be true. I don't care who pollutes, so long as the total's the same. Right? If that's not true, you don't want to do cap and trade. If you care who pollutes, then cap and trade isn't for you because you don't decide who pollutes, the market does. Right? So take, for example, a highly toxic chemical that, below a certain level, it doesn't hurt people, but as soon as you get above that level, it starts killing people right and left. Right, so it's got some dose response curve, it's very nonlinear. You just don't want to go above whatever level that is where it starts killing people. Now you impose a cap and trade system, guess what may happen? The one guy may buy a lot from the other, a lot of permits from the other, so that guy can pollute a lot. It may put them above that level where it starts killing people. Now, the pollutant might be fine in total if everyone kind of was below the critical level. But if you have cap and trade, you can't guarantee that. Some people may go above the critical level, causing more harm. That is, the harm may not be invariant to who pollutes, right, for the same total amount of pollution. We call that, in this world, it's called uniform mixing. Carbon dioxide is perfect for that. It doesn't matter who in the world emits carbon dioxide. The harm to future generations is identical because it goes up into the upper atmosphere and mixes evenly and causes harm regardless of who does it. China or us or Russia or whoever, it doesn't matter. Right, but for lots of things, that's not the case. It matters who does it because the harm will be different. If one person does a lot, another person does not at all. Does the Coase theorem say this? After all, Coase said Pagoo was wrong. So long as you have well-defined property rights, there's no externalities. So maybe there are problems. Does the Coase theorem say this? What does Coase require? He requires the victims to also be able to bargain. Right? The cap and trade systems we're imagining is just the polluters bargaining amongst each other. And so long as it doesn't matter who pollutes, you don't need the victims in the system. Right? The government's kind of standing in for them by setting the total amount. But amongst the victims, it doesn't matter because it's all the same as to who pollutes. Right? If you don't have uniform mixing, then you need the victims to come in and say, actually, I live near that mercury deposit. I'm going to pay you not to pollute. You need the victims in the system for Coase to apply. So Coase sort of saves the theory. He's not wrong in the sense that if there really were no transactions costs, there'd be no externalities. But for it to work in a cap and trade system, you need them in the system, which they're not usually there. Right, so long as there's no victims in the cap and trade system, then there is a problem with the Coase theorem, if you will. Not really Coase theorem, it's the non-Coase theorem, because you can have poor results with the property rights system. There are ways to fix the problem. You can do cap and trade systems that deal with non-uniform mixing. So for example, you can say to someone, if you go above some level, some critical level, the permits get more and more expensive for you, so that the permit cost kind of reflects the increased marginal harm that they cause. It's called trading ratios. You can do zones. You can only trade within this one zone. You can have minimum standards. You can say, well, you can buy and sell permits all you want, but you can never, go below this standard in terms of your pollution. Right? And if we look at actual cap and trade systems, you go back to that list we have, they have all these sorts of complications in them because there's always some problem with market design, non-mixing or something like that, where you need to have zones or trading ratios or minimum standards, all that kinds of stuff. Right? So the actual market design gets really complicated to deal with this issue. I already talked about this, measurement differences. For cap and trade to work well, you need to be able to measure pollution. And this has been an issue. Right, so when they set up the SO2 system, the very first major trading system, one of the issues was setting up what's called continuous monitoring of pollution. You needed to do that before you could set up the SO2 system. Right, same with the European ETS. They have several years of figuring out how to measure carbon dioxide out of individual plants before they could set up the ETS. Okay, morals. Might be lots of cases where we say, look, we just don't want to trade. We just think it's gross. And there's lots of examples like that. We want to trade babies or sex, maybe people, organs, all kinds of things that we might just say, look, it's just not, we don't want to be in that business for whatever reason. And there's lots of lists, lots and lots of writing on this. I think, although these are salient examples, I don't think they're that important. In the sense that most harm-causing activity, they're important things, don't get me wrong. Babies are important. The harm-causing activity, most harm-causing activity is not of this sort. Right? Most of the things we think about when we want to regulate aren't objectionable to trading. Now, some people objected to trading pollution. They said it's like, giving indulgences for sin. But most people have gotten over that for pollution. And so when we think about regulating most harm-causing activities, not the sort of thing where we have moral objections. But it might be. It might be. Also, the other thing to keep in mind with these moral objections is they're extremely contingent. Right? We consult our own intuitions as to what's moral or not, or maybe we read some philosophy. But if you look historically, it's changed a lot over time. So Martha Nussbaum brought this example up to me when I was writing about this, which is that singing in public, so opera, was considered equivalent to prostitution. 150, 200 years ago. Right, it was gross. You didn't do it if you were a proper person. And it's just not the case at all now. Now I have opera divas, right? It's just changed completely. And so, what seems morally awful to us now may be entirely contingent. It's really kind of hard to know. But I think, regardless, most of the times we regulate harm-causing activity, we're not dealing with these issues. But it's important to keep in mind. Okay, last but not least, market depth and marginal cost. You need to have a pretty deep market for the theory to work. So you don't get monopoly or monopsony problems or bilateral monopoly problems and so forth. You need to have many participants in fungible rights, and a lot of the markets on that list I showed you, the markets are pretty thin. And so they may not work very well. So for some of them, you may even need government approval for every trade, rather than just having an exchange or something like that. And once you're in that kind of world, you may not believe that cap and trade is doing a very good system because the markets aren't deep enough. And finally, the example I started with, the benefits were generated in that example because the marginal cost of reducing pollution was different for the two polluters. And so the gains from cap and trade systems kind of vary directly with how much different the marginal costs are among polluters. But if there's not a lot of difference, the government can just tell people what to do because they kind of know. Whereas if there's really different private information about marginal cost of pollution reduction, then the benefit of cap and trade is all the more. Well, that's kind of all I've got. The question then you might ask is, where else can we use this? And here, the imagination runs wild. It's almost anything you can think of. So some European countries have energy efficiency trading, We don't really have it in the United States, right? We say air conditioners have to have this energy efficiency, you got to put in this insulation and so forth. But we don't have to do that. We could just say, look, the overall industry of air conditioning has to have a certain level of efficiency, and you all figure out what machines to make, and if someone goes above it or below it, you can trade. Right? You can have energy efficiency trading. You can do safety trading. Right? OSHA right now says, here's how you have to build a ladder, and here's the size of a railing, and here's what the flooring has to be, and here's the helmets, and all that kind of stuff. You can just say to each plant, look, every year you report your safety record. You exceed the minimum safety standard, you get credits, you can sell to someone else. Overall safety stays the same, and plants that have really low costs of safety exceed the standards. Plants that have high costs of safety go above the standard. I don't know. Maybe you say there's a moral objection. I'm not sure. Privacy trading. Immigration trading. Someone proposed that. You can say, well, here's a quota on immigration. You can buy and sell these permits to come to the United States. Right? Total amount of immigration set. Zoning trading. Say, well, you know, you don't want to have this apartment building or this factory in your backyard. You're a NIMBY. You can buy, you basically pay someone else to take that upzoning, and so you can have trading of zoning districts in order to efficiently allocate where buildings go. Right? Once you start thinking about what the benefits are of trading, you can think of almost anything you want. Keeping in mind the 5 M's. Right? You don't want to propose trading where it's not going to work. All right, that is all I have. I'll stop the questions.